Hello, and welcome once again to Family Historian. My name is Stephen Conti. Was your ancestor a lumberjack? Well, if he was, this is definitely the show to watch because tonight we are going to learn how to find your lumberjack ancestor. And joining me on tonight's show, I am very honored to have as my guest a man named John Dorval. Aside from being a very fine historian, John descends from many of the early families of New Hampshire and Quebec, and in his earlier days, he did work as a lumberjack. And now, let's welcome John Dorval and go deep into the woods and go logging for our lumberjack ancestor. And now, here's John Dorval. John, welcome to my show.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great. You know, I feel as though I'm interviewing Paul Bunyan.
Oh, yeah.
The legendary Paul Bunyan. Do I yell out timber?
Yeah, if you're dropping a tree, sure.
Right. Now, John, before we get into the how-to of finding our lumberjack ancestor, take us way back in time to the history of the lumber industry in America.
Okay. Well, 1605, George Weymouth led a exploration vessel that sailed from northern Maine all the way down to Martha's Vineyard, exploring the New England coast.
And he was an Englishman.
He was from England, yes.
Okay.
And he had traversed one of the rivers in Maine, which was either the Penobscot or the Kennebec River, up about probably 50 or 60 miles, and paid particular note to the tall pines of Maine and the abundance of them. And he secured samples that he had brought back to England. And because of that fact, the white pine from Maine became known in Europe as the Weymouth pine.
The Weymouth pine.
Yes.
And we're talking 1605, very early.
1605, yep.
Right. Now, at that time, Maine was really part of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts.
Well, once Massachusetts became a colony in, was it 1620? Yes, it was part of the Massachusetts colony.
I see. Now, the next date I have is 1619.
Yeah.
And what do we say about that year?
1619 was when they colonized in Virginia, which was the first colony.
Jamestown.
Yes.
Okay.
And then New England, Massachusetts followed that in 1620.
Right. So the lumber industry really finds its roots in Maine.
Yes, for the most part. Yeah, they were also logging as well down in Virginia.
I see.
I mean, wherever there was a colony, they needed lumber for building.
Right, right.
And they had to, carve out of the woods area where they built houses, farms, and et cetera.
So they were harvesting the forests.
Yes.
Okay.
As well as clearing it.
Right. Now, these pines were very valuable.
Very.
To the early settlers of that area.
Yeah.
And they used them, the English used them for what? The English settlers there?
Well, they used them to build homes and barns and things like that, whatever needed building. And they had also used it for shipbuilding in England.
Right, for the English.
Yes, Navy.
English ships.
Yes.
The masts of the ships.
Right, the masts.
Very good. Okay. Now, the next date I have is 1623.
Yeah,
That's
1623.
a big year, okay?
Yeah.
And what happened in that year?
1623 is when the first sawmill was built in Maine, in New England, which was in York County.
Right.
And it was in like 1631, 1632 was when the second was built in Maine. And that was built in South Berwick.
Right.
But also, 1623, the Dutch had built three sawmills that were driven by wind on Manhattan Island.
Right. So the difference between the sawmills in New England and the one on Manhattan Island, they were run by two separate powers. And what were those?
Well, the power in New England was water. All the mills were driven by water.
Right, right.
And the ones that were in Manhattan were driven by wind. And the ones that were driven by water set the standard for sawmills for the next 200 to 250 years.
Right. Now, I understand Bangor, Maine
Yeah,
became the center
it did.
of the lumber industry.
It did, yes. And, situated on the Penobscot River, it was the last deep water port. So therefore, that's where the ships could come in and load up the lumber, and it would go to markets, all points of the world. But, there were, they would log further upriver, and they would drive the logs down to Bangor. And Bangor was pretty much built up by the lumber industry.
Right. Now, we do have another year here, 1770.
1770.
And I
yeah.
think the tall pines, it was also called the King's Woods.
Yeah, they were the King's Woods, and which started, the late 18th century and into the 19th century. All the the woods were the King's Woods, and there was a decree that anything over 24 inches was to be shipped back to England, and the colonists were not allowed to use it. It was a law.
Right, and this was a proclamation.
Yes, proclamation, and they...
and the king was King George
III.
King George III.
And we have a copy of a proclamation for the province of New Hampshire, just solidifying the fact that, if you get caught with any specified timber that they're not supposed to be using, they will be fined, and they could be imprisoned.
And it was a certain size of
Yeah,
timber.
yeah, 24 inches, which is 2 feet.
Anything over that.
Right, because they needed the tall pines for the mast, for the naval ships, as well as, boards for planking and stuff like that.
So this was one of the reasons that we had the
Yes.
American Revolution.
Yeah, that was one of the reasons,
One
yes.
of the reasons. Now, your ancestors go way back in New Hampshire.
Yeah.
As I mentioned, John Dorval descends from the earliest families of New Hampshire, and the homestead is still standing in New Hampshire.
Yep.
And you told me a story about the wood that
well,
it's made
it was built around 1710 by Samuel Weeks, and inside the building, it was built of brick, but inside there were timbers used and boards for floors and things, and there were boards in there that were over 24 inches, which made them outlaws, which they never got caught. But if they had, they could have been imprisoned, they could have confiscated their property. England was that serious about shipping that
or
lumber
paid
back.
a huge fine, of course.
And paid a huge fine on top of all that.
So the lumber industry found its roots in Maine.
Yep.
And then other colonies and states picked up on it. I know 1820 is the year Maine became a state.
That's right. Yes.
It was part of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And the next year we have is 1840.
Yeah, 1840.
So there were two states that became lumber leaders.
Yeah.
Those two states were New York and Pennsylvania, I
Right,
believe.
they became leaders in the lumber industry.
All right.
And, one of the major areas was Potter County, and around Wharton, Pennsylvania. And, what was happening was, the timbers were kind of, they weren't really running out in Maine, but westward expansion. They were looking, there were people looking to cut more timber, and,
Now, that's where you worked as a lumberjack.
I worked in Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey.
And this was a few years ago, we'll say.
Yeah, it wasn't that long ago.
Right. Did you enjoy it?
It was good work. Very rigorous and definitely very good for the physical, being.
But not as primitive as it was years ago.
Right, because of, the modern equipment and stuff like that, but it's still dangerous, just the same.
Now, John, we hear about the redwoods of California.
Yeah.
The Northwest. And that came about in around 1900.
Yes.
Is this what you had told me?
Right.
Okay. Now, I know that there is a book out there, if you would like to learn about the history of the lumber industry in America. It's called History of the Lumber Industry of America. And I believe it was written in the early 1900s.
Yeah, 1907.
1907. And tell us about this book. Would you say it's a very concise
It is very concise, and it starts with the very beginning of colonial times, and it takes you all the way through, all the way to the 1900s.
Right.
With westward expansion, and it really gets into deep detail of how much lumber was produced in each location. It covers even around the Great Lakes region, which became a major producer. By 1880, I believe it was, Michigan was the chief producer of lumber at that time.
Right.
And then from there, I mean, it went rapidly to, the Pacific coast.
Yeah. Okay. Now, let's talk about the woodsman's life, the life of the lumberjack. Okay. Now, I know you did this back in the 70s, I believe.
Mid 70s is when I really started.
But now we're going way back in time.
Yeah.
Can you tell our viewers, can you explain what life was like in those early days for the lumberjack?
Okay, yes. Of course, they stayed in camps. I mean, they were away from town.
Logging camps.
Yes, and they were along the rivers. Like, for instance, in Bangor, it was further upriver, up the Penobscot River.
Right.
And all the major rivers were sawmills, because the rivers are what, were the highways that moved logs.
Okay.
And they would stay in camps, and they were pretty primitive. They were usually, the earliest ones were log cabins, and usually just 2 beds in the cabin itself, and they ran along the walls. 2 huge beds, and all the lumberjacks all slept in the same beds.
And this was seasonal work.
Well, it was seasonal for the cutting. I mean, it would start at first snowfall. The cutters would go into the woods, start chopping trees. And then from there, they would, the logs would be hauled out to the yard, which was, somewhere centrally located to the cutting. And then from the cutting, they would be hauled down to the landing, which is down by the river, which would be over a mile away usually. And they were hauled out by either teams of oxen or a team of horses. And so they would, this would last, the cutting would last 24 to 28 weeks, and it would usually go into the end of January, mid-February.
So tell our viewers why the winter was very important for logging.
Okay, the winter is important because it was easier to skid the logs. They would, more easily ride over the snow.
Now, when you said skid,
That's hauling
the logs, and they would just go on the snow.
They would slide better on the snow.
Slide on the snow.
Yes.
Okay.
And besides that fact, they were easier to peel. Peeling the bark off.
Was that because of the sap that was?
Yeah, the sap would run in the spring, and then, and that would just make it a little more difficult to peel the bark.
Now, where did these men come from?
Oh, they came from, a lot of them were early settlers from Maine, in the Bangor area. And then some of them came from Scandinavia, some came from Scotland, some from Ireland. They were coming in from Canada, New Brunswick. They came from all over.
And I was told that a lot of these men were farmers, and they did this to make some extra money.
Yes, a lot of them were farmers, and they did do that to make extra money. But then there were many who this was their job. This is all they did year round.
Right.
Because when they got done hauling to the yard and the snow melted, the axemen would leave the woods, and they would usually go into town, get paid, and for 2 weeks it was a big party, like around the larger town, cities.
Right.
And a lot of them would spend all their money that they earned, and they'd go back into the woods, and they would help on the log drives.
Into the logging camp, which was in the woods. Yeah.
Yes.
Now, there were some women who were also living in the logging camp, and what did they do?
Yeah, that came later, and that came later in the mid to late 1800s, because now the camps had gotten a little, they weren't so primitive. They were still primitive, but not as primitive. And families would even move out into the woods, and then the women, the wives, or whatever, would serve as cook helpers. They would do laundry, so on.
They had a mess hall for the men.
Well, there was an area that was usually used as a mess area, usually in the camp, or it might even be an outdoor kitchen.
Right. And some of these logging camps the last remnants of them still exist.
Yeah, yeah.
And some of them, I read, became eventual villages. A logging camp became a village.
Yes, they did.
And they were usually outside of a main town, deep
Yeah.
in the forest.
Right.
I see. Okay. If you would like to learn about the life of the logger or the lumberjack, there is another book that we have here that John brought with him. It's called Recollections of a Long Life. And this was written in the early 1900s
Yeah.
by a man who was a lumberjack.
Right.
And what does he explain?
Well,
in
he
this,
lived through that period of time, and
Yeah.
mid 1800s to the early 1900s, and he worked in lumber camps throughout Maine,
Right.
the Midwest, and I believe he went all the way out to the Pacific Northwest as well.
Right.
And he explains his firsthand account of everything he did.
An eyewitness account,
Right.
out of being a lumberjack, and
That's
how
right.
rugged and Spartan a kind of life it
Yes,
was.
yeah.
Right, right. Very good. I never went to a logging camp, but I would like to visit one if they exist anymore, the last remnants of them.
Yes, they do have them.
Right, right. Now let's get to the how-to
Okay.
of finding our lumberjack ancestor. And you have listed some sources here. Can you tell our viewers the first source that the researcher can use in finding his or her lumberjack ancestor?
Well, the first one that I go to are the census records.
Mm-hmm.
And, wherever there was logging taking place, you could, go to those census records. And, 1850, 1860, throughout 1900s.
Right.
And you will find your ancestor there, and it will list their job title and so on, where they were from.
As a logger or a lumberman,
Yeah.
or something?
It would be listed as lumberman, logger, woodsman, even teamsters.
Right.
If you find teamsters in the logging community, they were hauling logs out of the woods.
So that is your lumberjack ancestor.
Yes.
Right. And I know there were nicknames in certain geographic areas, and there was one in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania.
Yes.
What was that nickname?
The Woodhicks.
Woodhick.
And I believe they also used it in West Virginia as well.
I see. But in Maine,
Pennsylvania.
was it called something else in Maine?
Just lumberman, woodsman, lumberjack.
So that's a regional, the hick.
I believe so, because I had never heard the term,
Yeah.
in the past.
It did not have a derogatory moment about it.
Yeah.
The woodhick is
Right.
not a derogatory term,
Yeah.
as it would be if you call someone a hick today.
Right.
I
right.
see. Now, we do have two examples. We have three examples of census records. One is from St. Anthony, Minnesota, for the year 1850. And you will see many of these men who are listed as lumberjacks or lumbermen or woodsmen. And then we also have one from 1860 in Old Town, Maine.
Yeah.
And again, it lists all of these men who lived in the logging camp,
Yes.
but were in that area, that county.
Right.
And we do have a third one here,
Yes.
John. And this is from, tell us where this is from and what year this is from.
Okay, this is Potter County, Pennsylvania, in Wharton Township, and it's from the year 1900. And it lists the names of the people that worked and lived in that area, and many of them worked in the lumber industry, which we have Henry Gore here, who it shows that he was from New York and he was a bark peeler. And most of the people on this are bark peelers. We have also J.N. Rutger, who was from Pennsylvania, was the cook. And then Joseph Darney, who was also from, he's from Scotland. He was also a cook. And then we have here, let me see, we have William Jeffries, who was from New York, another bark peeler. And we have Mart Malloy, who was from Maine.
Yes, very good.
And
so you do get a wealth
yes,
of information.
a wealth of information.
And this is the 1900 from where again?
This is Potter County, Morton Township,
Right,
Pennsylvania.
right. And I do want to thank the Potter County Historical Society for sending me a transcription of those original 1900 census records.
Yeah.
Very good. Now, what is the second source that we can use? What should the researcher look for? I mean, you've done the census research,
Yeah.
but there are alternative records as well.
Right. There's only so much information you're going to get out of the census records.
Right.
So therefore, I always go to the local historical societies and see what kind of information they may have. And many of them that are in those areas where logging was
So if
prevalent.
you know the geographic area
Right.
of where your ancestor came from, especially if it's in a lumber area,
Yep.
go to that local historical society.
Right.
And what information can that society give you?
Well, they can give you can find information on maybe logging companies and who worked for them and who's, where the camp was, and you might find pictures and
Right.
things like that, and lists of names who were in some of these logging camps.
Right. And we do have examples of a lumber company in Potter County, like a payroll
Yes.
listing.
Yes.
And you'll see how much your ancestor made as a lumberjack.
Right.
And there are several photos that have been captioned,
Right.
naming the people in the photo.
Right.
And we do have some examples to show you.
Yeah.
And you might see a whole family there.
Yeah.
So those are the two basic ones.
Right.
And you also mentioned university records.
Right.
Can you explain that to our
Yes, I
viewers?
found some records of in the University of Maine at Orono, which is a town on the Penobscot River just north of Bangor.
Right.
And they have records of the Penobscot Lumbering Association, which cover all of that between 1840 to 1950 or so. And that listed everything: payroll, log drivers, who lived in the lumber camps.
Right. And you have
so on.
used these sources?
Yeah, and what you would have to do is they're listed by box and folder, so you would call up the university, tell them what you want to look at, and they will pull it out for you. And you do this by appointment only. So
Right.
then you would go there and you read through all these documents and copy whatever you want for your own, for your family history.
Right, right.
So
And there's one more source, lumber,
museums.
and I did find a wonderful one in Pennsylvania. It's the Pennsylvania Lumber Museum in where else? Potter County, which
Yes.
is in north central
Right.
Pennsylvania.
Yes.
And they will sometimes have records there.
Yeah.
And there are many lumber museums throughout the country. I think
Yes.
there's one in, I think it's Wisconsin or
There- yes,
Michigan.
yes.
The Paul Bunyan,
Right.
a very apt name for a lumber museum, Paul Bunyan. And they will have sources as well.
Right.
Okay. Before we close, I do want to show you some photos of modern day lumberjacks. And the first one we have is of
My stepfather and my brother.
your stepfather and your brother.
Yes.
And where did they do logging?
They've logged all over, but their last place of logging was clearing land for construction in New Jersey.
Really?
And this particular tree that they cut in this photo was in Mount Laurel, New Jersey, and this is a huge tree. I mean, it's not the record, but it's pretty close to the record. And it's rare to find a tree this big.
What kind of tree was it?
This one here is a poplar, hybrid poplar, which is known as a tulip.
I see. And they were clearing land for...
Yeah, mall or whatever. I'm not even sure what they were clearing for, but they were clearing for a store, hospital,
Right.
That's
and
what they did.
You go way back in the lumberjack
Yeah, I
families.
started. Yeah, my stepfather was a logger. His family goes like 4 or 5 generations back in Maine, and we moved to Pennsylvania when I was 10 years old, and for the reason of there was better wages in the logging industry
Yeah,
and so
yeah.
on. So my stepfather, he started taking me in the woods when I was 10, and I learned to, operate a skidder. I started, learning how to operate a chainsaw and learning the industry, and then throughout my my teens until I was 18, when I joined the Navy, I was working summers and weekends and things like that.
As a lumberjack?
As a lumberjack, yes. And then when I got out of the Navy, I also worked in the woods doing, land clearing and logging and such.
And we do have a photo of John. How old were you in this photo?
10 years old.
10 years old, working the skidder.
Right. Yep.
And that was a hard job.
It was. And in that particular photo, I'm on the landing and I'm pushing the logs up on the pile.
Right.
And that's pretty exciting for
Tell
a 10-year-old.
me, did lumberjacks belong, years ago, did they belong to a union?
There were really no unions. There were associations, but it wasn't really unionized. And I can tell you they really didn't make much money. They didn't make what they should. The people that really made the money were the ones that owned the sawmills, and they became known as lumber barons in the 1800s. Right. But, other than that, there probably aren't even any unions today. There might be a couple, but not that I know
Give
of.
us an example of the lumberjack salary in those days.
Those days. For the time they spent in the woods, they might walk out of the woods with $150, a couple $100 for
the whole season.
For the 24, 28 weeks.
Yeah.
Then the log drivers would make more money because that was more dangerous. A lot of guys were killed on those log drives.
Right. Okay, before we close, I just want to go over those three main sources for the genealogist, and you can name them.
The census records.
Okay, which is a very common source. We've been using it for years.
Yep.
And also?
Yep. Then the local historical societies, or regional or state historical societies, and then museums,
And if you really have the time, the university.
Yes, university. Yeah, but you would have to go in person to read these particular, transcripts or original copies, whatever they may be.
Right. Well, this has been a wonderful interview, learning about your lumberjack ancestor with my fine guest historian and former lumberjack, John Dorval. John, thank you very much for coming on my show. And on that note, and pardon the pun, we're going to log off. And as usual, as I say every week, remember, we are all descendants of ancient civilizations. Genealogy is your key to the history of your family. And so until next time, this is Stephen Conti wishing you the very best of luck in your research, and above all, happy ancestor hunting. Good night.